Good morning. It's Sunday, July the 4th. Happy Independence Day to my American friends. It's a very special day, an opportunity for us to acknowledge the greatness and the faithfulness of God, especially in that context, as we here in Canada have also recently celebrated our national holiday. It's a time when we're reminded of God's abundant blessings and how important it is to trust Him and follow His ways, which is what we are reflecting on today as we continue our series looking at Psalms taken from the 5 books of Psalms, one book, but divided into 5 smaller books. And we're seeing how there are connections between these 5 books of Psalms and the first 5 books of the Bible. So far, we've looked at Book 1, 2, and 3 in the Psalms, considering connections with Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. And today we are at Book 4, the section of Psalms that begins at Psalm 90 and goes through Psalm 106. And we're thinking about how a particular psalm there, Psalm 95, connects with the book of Numbers. Psalm 95 is a beautiful, poetic, majestic psalm, very familiar to us. And we'll see, especially because there's a specific reference in that psalm to an incident recorded in the book of Numbers, we'll see how the 4th book of the Bible and the 4th book of Psalms connect to each other. So let's hear these words of Psalm 95. Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before Him with thanksgiving and extol Him with music and song. For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods. In His hand are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to Him. The sea is His, for He made it, and His hands formed the dry land. Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker. For He is our God, and we are the people of His pasture, the flock under His care. Today, if only you would hear His voice. Do not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah, as you did that day at Masa in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested me. They tried me, though they had seen what I did. For 40 years I was angry with that generation. I said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. One of the more familiar Psalms, in fact, some of those verses are read quite regularly at the beginning of worship services as a call to worship. Verses 6 and 7 especially. Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For He is our God, and we are the people of His pasture, the flock under His care. Such incredible, reassuring words, especially at the beginning of a worship service, because these words describe the beauty and the power of what a relationship with God looks like, a relationship of trust, of worship, and of tender care. Psalm 95 has a number of important things to tell us about God, about who God is. Who is God according to Psalm 95? Well, He's the great God, the supreme ruler, the great and powerful creator of the world, the great King and God above all other gods. But He's not only this majestic, powerful God who created the world, He also takes care of what He made. In His hands are all the seas and mountains. Everything made by God's hands continues to be held in the hands of God. Even more amazing than this is the fact that this majestic, awesome God is one who knows us personally and whom we can trust implicitly. That's why that image of God being like a shepherd is so beautiful, and how we can see ourselves as His sheep, a flock under His care. So God is not only the epitome of power, He's the fullness of love. He cares for us with tenderness and compassion. It's why Psalm 95 is a call to worship, and not only in the context of a worship service formally. Psalm 95 leads us to an awareness of God's majesty and tender love in any way and every way that we can experience that. And what do we do when we acknowledge all of this? We worship. Formally in an act of worship, perhaps, but all of life is worship. We acknowledge God's greatness and his beauty, and we see ourselves and each other as members of a flock that God cares for. We also acknowledge that we serve and obey this majestic God. That's why the image of kneeling and bowing is so important in this psalm. We might not practice that in our own worship traditions so much, but these postures are so instructive. They acknowledge the greatness of God. We make ourselves small in God's greatness, acknowledging that God alone is great. We are so small, helpless, in fact. There's that. And then there's also the posture of obedience. We bow and kneel as those who are servants of God, who, by making ourselves small in that posture, are communicating something important, that we want to obey God, that we want to do his will. Now, it's such a wonderful and powerful psalm, but when we get to verse 8, actually the end of verse 7, the psalm takes an unexpected turn, and I'm sure you picked up on that as I read the words again to you today. Today, if only you would hear his voice. That's what we read at the end of verse 7. So picture yourself in a worship gathering, an incredible worship gathering. There's exuberant joy, boisterous worship, expressive praise, lots of extolling the name of God, declaring his majesty, kneeling and bowing in the presence of the great King. It's all great. It's all good. We see ourselves as sheep in the care of this great shepherd. And then picture or imagine hearing the leader of a worship service saying this, "If only you would hear God's voice." The implication is that people are not interested in hearing God's voice. And so the one leading worship is actually kind of encouraging people. Hear this voice. Listen today to the voice of God. You might wonder why Psalm 95 takes this unexpected turn. It's almost as if this great worship service has unexpectedly gone off the rails, and there's this bucket of cold water thrown on all the joy and boisterous worship. There's a stern warning that concludes the psalm. Don't harden your hearts like your ancestors did. It's as if the person leading worship is saying, please remember your history. Learn from your history. Remember what happened centuries ago when your ancestors tested God, angered God, and were punished by God. Don't let that happen again. What's this all about? Well, it brings us straight into the book of Numbers. Book 4 of the Psalms, particularly Psalm 95 in Book 4, does connect with Book 4 of the Bible, the book of Numbers. Psalm 95 refers to two incidents that took place in the wilderness journeys of the Israelites as they made their way from Egypt to the Promised Land. Verse 8 refers to two separate places and incidents in Israel's history, Meribah and Masa. Now, it's interesting that in both of these places, God did something incredible. The people, of course, were in a very harsh desert environment. They needed water to drink for themselves, their families, their livestock. And so God miraculously provides water from a rock. He does this first at Meribah. We read about that in Exodus 17. This is the very beginning of the Israelites' wilderness journey. And he does it again in Numbers chapter 20, what should have been the end of their wilderness journey. I mean, it's not a huge distance to travel from Egypt to the land of Canaan. But as the book of Numbers tells us, it took the people 40 years to make this journey. Why? Well, this is what the book of Numbers talks about how the people, when they were on the brink of entering the land of promise, sent spies into the land to explore it, to bring back a report, to describe what the land was like, and especially what the people living there were like. So Moses commands 12 spies to go into the land, one representing each tribe of Israel. And if you know the story, you know that 10 of those 12 spies came back with a very discouraging report. They said, yes, this is an incredible land. It is flowing with milk and honey. It's great, but we'll never have any chance of conquering the people that live there. All the cities are fortified. The people who live there are strong. They're giants. We're like grasshoppers to them. Only 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, give an encouraging report. They say, we can do this. God is with us. Don't despair. But the people believed the report of the 10 spies. They began to lament, and they rebelled against Moses. They said, believing the report of these spies, we have no chance. We're just going to be slaughtered. It would be better for us to just go back to Egypt. Why, Moses, did you even bring us out of Egypt? To die here? They want to kill Moses. They want to appoint a new leader. This is the history of the people's wilderness journey in a nutshell. One of grumbling, of disobedience, and rebellion. God hears all of this, and he tells Moses that none of those people in the entire community of Israel who are over the age of 20 will enter the promised land, except for 2, Joshua and Caleb. Only they trusted God and called the people to faithful obedience. For 40 years, they would wander in that wilderness, just wandering around until everybody 20 years old and over died there. Not even Moses would be able to enter the promised land, and this brings us again to Numbers 20, because instead of speaking to the rock, as God told Moses to do, he struck it with his staff. Water did come out of the rock, miraculously, but because Moses disobeyed God, he himself, the great leader who struggled and suffered so much as a leader, was not able to enter the promised land. And so this is really what the book of Numbers is all about. It's a long history of rebellion, of lament, of disobedience, wilderness journeying. It's a story of death and destruction that are direct results of disobedience. And this is what Psalm 95 refers to in verses 10 and 11. For 40 years I was angry with that generation, God says. I declared in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. Now that does conclude Psalm 95 on a very serious note. It does temper all of the joy of the expressive worship that we read about at the beginning part of the psalm. But like the verses that precede these concluding verses, these words of God do clarify for us still today what a relationship with God ought to look like. It tells us that we too need to learn from our history. This is why reading the Bible is so important. This is our history, our spiritual history. And there are many, many lessons to be learned from reading the Bible and applying those lessons to our lives. Psalm 95 encourages us to remember that today, this moment, and every day provides us with an opportunity to hear God speaking to us. Important words that we need to hear. It shows us that our lives today in a relationship with God are exactly as the way God intended to have people relate to Him in every age, in every place. This is why Psalm 95 refers to hearts twice in those concluding verses. The warning not to have hearts that are hard. Don't harden your hearts like your ancestors did. And then the description of God as He characterizes that rebellious generation as people whose hearts went astray. Now, both of these things that refer to hearts are important for us because they indicate how important it is for us to have hearts that are open to God and hearts that are receptive and full of worship, yes, but also a desire to serve, to obey this great, majestic God. This is why in the book of Hebrews, the writer quotes Psalm 95, saying, today, if you hear His voice, that today is every day, in every generation. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, the promise of rest is as true for us as it was for the Old Testament people. Their rest was a literal kind of rest in a land of promise, of peace and abundance. But for us, it's a spiritual rest that we have in Christ. And today, if you hear the voice of God, enter that rest. Come into a relationship with Jesus Christ, who is the rock of our salvation. It brings me to 1 Corinthians 10, where the Apostle Paul reflects on the Old Testament history of the people of Israel, and he has lots of stories and references there. And he says, all of these stories are written as warnings for us, so that we don't make the same mistakes that these people did. They're examples for us to follow. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It's an incredible chapter because he actually talks there about how the rock that gave water to the people in the Old Testament wilderness was Christ. That rock was Christ, a very cryptic reference, and we don't have time to go into all of the details associated with that. But what Paul is basically saying, similar to what the writer of the book of Hebrews says, is that these Old Testament stories and experiences have so much importance in our lives today on a much higher spiritual level, because Christ is the fulfillment of these stories. He brings us into eternal rest, and he gives us water as the rock of our salvation. That is not just literal water that quenches our thirst temporarily, but life-giving water, the water of life. It's exactly as Jesus described this water to the woman at the well in John 4, the water that once you drink of it, you will never thirst again. The water that springs up from within you, becoming a well that flows out from you as a testimony of God's love and power. Now, what does all of this really then mean for us? Well, I think Psalm 95 makes it quite clear that for us as people in every generation, a relationship with God consists of trust and obedience. It's like the old hymn puts it, trust and obey, for there's no other way. Trust and obedience, that we acknowledge God as the great King, that we trust him as our shepherd, who takes care of us, even in all the hard desert places of our lives. Trust also knowing that God holds all the deep places in his hands. This is a reference to places that we can't see. They're hidden, they're deep and mysterious. All of our wilderness journeys are known to God. Nobody else may see them. They're hidden to them. We may not even be able to speak of these experiences at times because they're so painful, but they're known to God. They're held by God. We are held by God in those wilderness places. So this is what trust suggests. We bow before the presence of a mighty God, trusting that he will take care of us. And we bow as servants who indicate our desire to obey this God every day, not making mistakes that people in previous generations have done, but learning from our history, and learning especially from the history that is revealed in the person and work of Jesus Christ, the giver of living water, the rock that was struck. Think of how he was struck down on his cross, beaten, bruised, nailed to a cross, killed, struck. But in this way, we experience the joy and life-satisfying quenching of the Spirit of life, the water of life that he provides. Today, if you hear his voice, even if you hear this message today, don't let your heart be hard. Be open to God. Drink that water that God alone provides as your shepherd who cares for you, as your king who made you, who holds you, and who will lead you through the work of Christ into that eternal place of rest and abundance. Today, make yourself open to God. Don't let hearts that are hard go astray. The one follows the other. If you harden your heart, you will go astray, because we're all looking for rest, and our rest ultimately is only found in him. I hope this message has encouraged you, has enabled you to experience God's presence with you in the wilderness, and the assurance you can have knowing that God leads you out of that wilderness. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness, a representation of the 40 years of the people of Israel. He will lead us out. Thanks be to God. Be well and be blessed.